yarn with Kool-Aid, you need 1 skein of undyed wool or any fiber from an animal. You'll need Kool-Aid. You need 2 to 4 packs of Kool-Aid for every 2 ounces of yarn that you have. You need a contrasting yarn that you can use to tie your skeins, a scissor to cut the yarn, a bowl to soak your yarn in, a stock pot to simmer it on the stove, a spoon for stirring, and you'll need some kind of drying rack. I'm just going to put this dowel over my kitchen sink, which is an easy way to do it. Yarn comes in lots of different forms: balls, skeins, hanks. In order to dye it with Kool-Aid, you need to use it in this form, which is just a loosely tied skein. If your yarn comes in a figure-8 form, then you can open up the figure-8 and it will look like this. But we're going to use this yarn, this Northampton Bulky. I'm going to show you how to make it into a loosely tied hank like this. Right here I have the other half of what I used to create this, and I know it'll make about 2 ounces. So I'm going to show you how to make the skein. So I'm just unwrapping it a little bit. Now, if you're doing it by yourself, this is the method you use. Just grab, or this is one method you can use. Grab the end of the yarn and start wrapping it around your elbow. You do not want it to be too tight, or else you won't be able to move your arm. And it'll be hard to even get it off. And so I'm just wrapping it around, wrapping it around. Now, if you have a friend that you're doing this with, and I imagine you'd be doing this probably with kids, then one person can hold their arms up, straight up vertically, and the other person can wrap the yarn around their hands. And that's kind of a fun way to do it. And I think lots of people have great memories of doing things like that with their moms or grandmothers. Or another way to do it, if you're doing it on your own, is to use the back of a chair and just kind of loosely hold the first end of the yarn on one side of the chair and then wrap around. You don't want to lose track of the beginning of the yarn. So when you do that, you just want to make sure you're sort of conscious of where you're putting it. So right now, with this method, I am holding the end of the yarn. If you lose it, it's not a big deal. You just have to go kind of searching for it. Because when you're finished wrapping, you're going to loosely tie the beginning end and the end that you get to when you finish. Another way to do this, if you're working on your own, is to do it around the back of a chair that has a straight back with 2 pieces sticking up. And you would basically tie loosely the beginning of the yarn on one side, do all of your wrapping, and then when you finish, find that beginning tie and just undo it, and then you're going to tie the 2 ends of the yarn at that point. So I'm almost finished now, and I'll show you how to tie those 2 ends. So here, that's nice. You want to make sure that this doesn't get too tight, then the dye might not penetrate. You want to try throughout this whole process to not tangle up the yarn. After you tie the 2 ends of the yarn that you used, then you just take a contrasting yarn and you cut pieces of it, I'd say about that long. I don't know if that's about 9 inches. It's not really important that it's a specific measurement. You just want to be able to tie it around the skein loosely. So I'm just making a small knot here. You want it to stay around the yarn, but you don't want it to be tight, because if it was tight, then the dye doesn't penetrate there. I'm going to cut another piece of yarn now, and I'm just going to tie it around. So again, I make a knot that I think will hold, but doesn't press up against the yarn. So you see with that one, there's a little bit of extra there. It'll make it a little easier to handle. And I can tell you from experience that I've dealt with tangled yarn, and I always think, oh, it's not going to get tangled, and then it does. So I try to be a little extra cautious with this part of the process. Now, if you're doing this with kids and you're doing multiple skeins of yarn, and everybody wants to kind of know which skein is theirs, which is usually important to kids, when you use the contrasting yarn, you can just use a different color for each kid. So that way, when it comes out of the pot, you'll know. But you do have to notice that these colors, the contrasting yarn, is going to get dyed as well. So you kind of have to keep track of that. Another thing that you can do if you don't feel like you'll be able to keep track of that, and you might have kids arguing over whose skein is whose, is that you can just take this tail from when you tied the beginning and the end together, and you can say, you know, Susie's yarn has 1 knot in the end of the tail, and Johnny's yarn has 2 in the end of the tail. Just whatever you need to do if you think it's important to the people involved to be able to identify one person's yarn from another. So once you have your skein, what you need to do is soak it in water. And we have prepared here a bowl of cool water. And you basically just put the yarn in the water, kind of press it down. It's going to want to float up in the beginning, but you're going to leave it for a minimum of 30 minutes. And if you pass by during that 30 minutes, just try to press it down. You just need enough water that you feel like all of the yarn is going to get saturated. And when that happens, the yarn kind of becomes much more receptive to the dye. So it's pretty important that you take the time to soak the yarn. So if you're working with kids and you don't think they're going to be patient, or you don't think they're going to want to make these skeins, then you might want to do this in advance and have them come in at this point after the 30 minutes. So my yarn has been soaking for a little over 30 minutes. So now I can actually mix up my dye and get started with the actual dyeing process. I have 2 stock pots here because we're actually going to do 2 different colors. I'll start out with the first one. I think we're going to do 2 lemonade and 1 pink lemonade. These are both pretty subtle colors. As you can imagine, the lemonade is yellowy and the pink lemonade is a little bit pink. So we'll see what happens. I have about 4.5 quarts of water in this stock pot. It's not important that it be an exact amount, but you want enough water so that the yarn can really be in the water and can move around a little bit. You don't want it to be crowded. You want to stir the dye before you put the yarn in, because throughout the process you want to be as gentle as possible with your yarn, because if you mangle your yarn or if you agitate it, it's more likely to felt and tangle. So when you pull it out, it's good to pull it out from one of the cords that you tied to hold it. Again, it's just an effort to keep it from getting all twisted around. So just to not drip too much on the counter, I'll squeeze it a little. Gently drop it into the water. So I'll put this on the stove. Because I wanted to show you more than one color, I actually soaked some extra yarn so that we could get 2 stock pots going. I do want to also point out, we soaked the yarn here and then we're putting it into another pot of water. You want to keep the temperature of the water just consistently cool. You don't want yarn going in hot water and cold water or anything like that. And you always want to put your yarn into the water. You don't ever want to pour water onto your yarn. So I'm going to do 3 packets of grape for this one. And I know that my skeins are about 2 ounces. And as I said, you're going to use, I find that 2 to 4 packets of Kool-Aid per 2 ounces of yarn is a good amount. Obviously, more Kool-Aid is going to make a darker color, less is going to make a lighter color. It's kind of interesting because to know when your yarn is done and it's been dyed, you wait until the water is clear. Some colors I've found stay just a tiny bit cloudy, the water does, but a lot of the colors do become perfectly clear. So I have my extra skein of yarn that I soaked. Try to remember to pick it up by one of your cords. Now I'm going to gently place my yarn in the water, and you can already see if I pull it out, it's starting to turn very light purple. So that Kool-Aid stuff works quickly. It's kind of funny to imagine what our stomachs look like if we drink it. All right, so I'm going to put this on the stove now. Okay, I'm going to turn this on to a low simmer. Okay, that's too high. I want it pretty low. I say a low simmer, but it's just barely a simmer is what you want. And then you're going to leave it on the stove for up to 30 minutes approximately. The way you'll know that it's done is that the water will be clear. So now I'll just turn this one on. Very low simmer. Now while it's simmering, you should keep an eye on it, look at it from time to time. You can stir it gently a couple of times because you want to make sure that all of the yarn gets dyed and that the dye actually penetrates all of the fiber, but you don't want to be rough with it at all, and you don't want to stir it a lot because it'll get tangled and it might felt. It's been about 15 minutes, so I'm going to check the yarn. Here we have our lemonade and pink lemonade color, which is coming along nicely. It's a really pretty light peach. And the water is a little bit cloudy still. I found that sometimes with these light colors, the cloudiness doesn't go away, but we'll leave it for a little while longer, see if there's any more dye there. And now I'll check the grape. It's definitely looking purple, but this one looks like it still has a long time to go, or maybe 10 or 15 more minutes at least, because the water is still pretty dark. I'm going to raise the temperature just a little bit, but I'm going to keep an eye on it because sometimes, if you go too far and then it starts boiling, that's not a good thing. But we'll just wait about another 15 minutes to see if that's done. While our yarn is simmering, I'm going to show you another neat technique. You can also dye yarn with Kool-Aid in the same way that you make sun tea. You put your Kool-Aid in your water and you stir it up just like we did with the stock pot. In this case, I'm going to use Tropical Punch Kool-Aid. So what color do you think that will be? It will be very, very red. I'm going to use 2 packs of Tropical Punch. And the reason I'm picking 2 is because I recently dyed some yarn with Tropical Punch and I saw that the color was very strong with just 2. So I'm not going to use 4 packets, I'll just use 2. So I'm going to stir it up before I put the yarn in it. And if you were with us here, you would just smell your childhood in this kind of cherry smell. And I'm going to take my yarn from the cord. And now I'm going to dunk it into our pitcher and make sure it's submerged. And then you put it out in the sun. I've done this on a hot summer day and I've been able to dye the yarn in just a couple of hours, and I know it's dyed because this water that looks this very, very red color becomes completely clear. If it's not a hot day, it's not really sunny, it will take longer. And if it's a day where the sun goes behind the clouds and you feel like you want to be done, you can just take it into the house, pull the yarn out, pour the dye water into a stock pot, put your yarn back in, and simmer it on the stove to quicken it up. But if you are putting it outside, I recommend that you put some saran wrap or something on it so that it doesn't get bugs or anything in it. So my yarn is dyed. My water is pretty much clear. With the lemonade color, it's slightly cloudy, which I found does happen with the lemonade colors, but it's for the most part, it's clear. I've cooled it off enough to the point where I can handle it. And now I'm just going to transfer it to a bowl of warm water. And this is just kind of a double check to make sure that there's not any more dye, because if there is dye in that, then it could sort of come off. If you make something out of it and then you wash it, the dye will come off. But as long as it's clear, as long as your water stays clear, then you're safe and you can just dry it. So I think that looks good. Now we have our grape yarn. Our water is clear. I'm just going to pull it out. Obviously, if you're working with kids, you want to check that really carefully because you don't want any kids to feel like they're burning their hands. Just move this over, gently put it into, I guess you could call this rinse water. And I feel pretty confident that the water is clear. So I'm just going to move these stock pots out of the sink. Because what I'm doing for a makeshift drying rack is I've just put a dowel over the sink. I'll just pull my yarn out. And I'm just gently squeezing on it. I'm not twisting it, not wringing it, just gently squeezing it. I think this was the lemonade flavors, the pink lemonade and lemonade. just hang it over here and leave it to dry. Here's the grape. It's pretty purple. Hang it here. So all of that yarn is going to take a few hours to dry. And we don't have a few hours for this class. What I've done is I've brought in a sampling of some other yarns that I dyed. Remember, we started with undyed yarn. We did, here we did the Northampton Bulky. What I did was the company Webb's that makes this line of yarn called Valley Yarns, they gave me a bunch of different yarns. And it's really interesting to dye yarns that are made of different fibers and that are spun in different ways because they do take the dye differently. So for example, this is called Valley Superwash. It's 100% extra fine merino. And I made little labels here. And if you want to be kind of keep track of what you're doing, then you could make labels for your yarn. Remember, you can't put these paper labels on until after your yarn is dry. You can't, try to dye yarn with the label because your labels will fall apart. But this is 3 pink lemonade and 1 lemonade. And it's kind of neat. This is, what yarn was this? This is again the Valley Superwash. This is 4 lemonades. Lemonade is a pretty mild color. This is kind of as dark as it's going to get. But if we look here, this is also 4 lemonades, but this is a different yarn. And you see it's a little bit paler, even though it's the exact same dye. And that just has to do with the type of fiber it is and the way it's spun. This one is kind of interesting. It's what I think is a pretty brown color, but I actually over-dyed the yarn. That means I dyed it once. I started out, it was 3 peach mango. And it was an orange that I didn't like at all. So then I thought, oh, let me try to fix that. So then I went through the whole process again, and I did 2 pink lemonade. And unfortunately, then it was worse. So then I did what I needed to do to just mix up so many colors that I would end up with brown. And so I added grape for that. And grape is a great color to sort of just create a beautiful brown with if you just kind of mix it up. Here's the tropical punch color. This is the color we used when I showed you the sun dyeing method. So, as you can see, starting from this and ending up with a palette like this is really kind of magical. This isn't serious business, this is Kool-Aid, have fun with it, and then it's time to knit.